Transgression is the breaking of social norms and values. This can come in many forms. I will be focusing on how the cinema experience can be viewed in a transgressive way for people to experience the breaking of their social norms. As everyone knows, the film industry has been around for a very long time and grown into a multi-billion-dollar business, but it all started in 1895 by the Lumiere brothers, who created one of the first motion picture cameras and released the first ever moving images. Though their films were only less than a minute long, they had no idea the effect that they would have on modern-day society. The film industry ranges from the independent films, massive money-making franchises, all the way to art house films. All films, however, are considered to be an art form and a way of conveying culture. So not only is film entertaining, but it can also be quite educational. However, I will be focusing on how the cinema has always been used by some to show the breaking of social norms and values. Although the term cinema of transgression was first created by Nick Zedd in 1985 to describe his group of filmmaker friends who created films that were intended to shock the audience, transgressive film has occurred for over 100 years. Even through silent films, directors could convey a breaking of social norms. The Birth of a Nation by David Griffith in 1915 is a good example of this. This film depicts the American Civil War and focuses heavily on the treatment of African Americans during the time and how the Ku Klux Klan treated them. Already a film on war, it is showing people basically murdering people on screen, and in this film you also see the Ku Klux Klan lynch an African American. This film is not only informative of what occurred but brutally honest, so people could see the transgressive acts that actually took place. On the other hand, you have art films from the era like The Andalusian Dog by Luis Buñuel and Salvador Dali in 1929. This film has no real story to it and no real intention but to entertain. Apparently the script was based around suppressed human emotions. Another way of saying this is the urge to transgress that people have and the thrill of breaking social norms. One scene in the film involves someone's eye being cut open, and as the film has no real narrative, we have no idea why. The film was intended to shock viewers, and Dali was said to be disappointed it didn't cause more of an uproar. People actually thoroughly enjoyed it. It led to a new art form for cinema for the surrealists of the time. More films were churned out, with honestly quite horrifying results in the intention to shock viewers. This can therefore be seen as a way to transgress by viewers as their morbid curiosity gets the better of them, as they want to see acts they cannot actually commit in their everyday lives. Still remaining on silent film, an important man to mention would obviously be Charlie Chaplin and his film The Great Dictator, released in 1940. This film is about a dictator in Germany in the late 30s. It is a clear satirical view of Hitler and the Nazi regime. The film was very controversial at the time, as you can imagine. This was before America had entered the war. Chaplin was known for being very outspoken on political matters, which eventually led to his deportation from America. This film is a transgression of making fun of authority figures. Obviously it's meant to entertain viewers, but it also informs people of how bad the Nazis were using humour. It also makes Hitler seem like less of a threat and more of a joke. This is an example of how films can be used to step over boundaries in the forms of politics, as Chaplin was urged by many officials to not release the film on a political basis. As it turns out, this was Chaplin's most commercially successful piece of work. After the 30s, talkies became the main form of cinema. This resulted in a completely new cinema experience. Then after World War II, there was the Cold War. Around this time, science fiction and war films dominated the screen. This reflected the world's anxieties of the threat of nuclear war. These films depicted events like invasion, genocide and annihilation from fictional space beings. A good example of this would be Day of the Triffids by Steve Zeakley in 1963. This shows a clear change in cinema as the films were centered on the audience's fears. This was then when filmmakers began trying to exploit people's anxieties, and people loved it. Even though terrified, people still enjoyed the thrill of being scared. This then led to the horror genre playing a very important role in cinema. Horror films, as we all know, are created with the intent to terrify the audience. However, some horror films do not even have a proper narrative. It can literally be the simplest story with very graphic scenes that people will be scared of. For example, Alfred Hitchcock's film The Birds, made in 1963. It's about a town where birds suddenly decide to go insane and kill everyone. There's the obvious romantic side to the narrative, but other than that, no real story. What Hitchcock does is take an everyday object like birds and make people afraid of them. Before watching this film, I bet not many people had even considered birds to be scary. But once you see someone pecked to death on a giant screen, then maybe start to reconsider that decision. During this time, a lot of horrors were released about normal things taking a turn for the worst, and the audience loved it. People were getting a thrill out of seeing scary things happen to people on screen. Through films, many social taboos can be broken. For example, there was a time when if you criticised any part of religion, then you would be called a blasphemer. An example of when this taboo is broken is Monty Python's Life of Brian by Terry Jones in 1979. It follows the life of Brian, who was mistakenly called the Messiah during the times Jesus was around. The film allows people to laugh about certain parts of the Bible and has become a classic. As you can imagine, this film was very controversial for the time, but it became the pivotal moment of when films could begin to make satire of religion. Again, even films like this can be a comment about society. As we all know, religion has played a large role in society, but as we become more secular, people feel they can finally make fun of certain aspects of religion. As you can imagine, as the film industry went on, more and more films are created that break social norms. But some films go above and beyond to not only scare a viewer but shock them as well. Films like The Human Centipede or a Serbian film by Srđan Spazijevic in 2010 are perfect examples of this. There's so much artistic freedom nowadays that films like these really push the boundaries of how far people will go to get a thrill, out of seeing something that in everyday life is disgusting. The director of a Serbian film claims that it is really a comment on how the people of Serbia actually feel about authority, and how they have the urge to break this hold it has on them. It could be argued that so many films showing transgressive acts have been made and become part of our culture that people have become desensitized to it, so films nowadays need to be something very gruesome to get a reaction from the audience. As I said before, there is so much artistic freedom nowadays. This goes especially for independent films. One social taboo that is being challenged at the moment is sexuality and erotica. After the release of 50 Shades of Grey, sexual acts became a topic that was more accessible for people to look upon and talk about. The films Nymphomaniac Volume 1 and 2 by Lars von Trier in 2013 opened people's eyes to the world of sex and things that go on behind closed doors. They touch on topics of BDSM, fetishism, and even paedophilia. The film follows a sex addict as she discovers her overbearing desire for sex. This allows viewers to get a better understanding of these things without having to do it themselves. They can just watch while sat on the sofa at home. Some people don't like to admit it, but sex is a part of everyone's life and it can sometimes be an awkward topic to talk about. But through transgressive films, people can be educated on elements of sex as they break down the boundaries placed on us by our social norms and values. The final area of transgressive films I want to talk about is drug use. Obviously, drugs are illegal and therefore not just a social taboo to break, but an actual law. The film types can range from stoner comedies like Cheech and Chong to harrowing films like Requiem for a Dream by Darren Aronofsky at the beginning of the millennium. This is particularly interesting because it follows people not only taking illegal drugs like heroin, but also an addiction to prescription drugs like dieting pills. It's a comment on how society demonizes one sort of addict, whereas other addictions can actually be seen as normal. This film starts with showing the side of enjoyment with drugs in the first half, but in the second half the disastrous results they can have on someone's life. Through drug use films, people can receive a better understanding as to why people will use drugs, but also understand the horrors that can come with it. Even if you remove yourself from the actual films, the act of going to the cinema has become a sort of ritualistic behaviour for many cultures now. Going to the cinema isn't just about people wanting to be up to date with current films, but also a place to socialise either as families, friends, or even as partners. As for transgression, some people even go to the cinema to commit transgressive acts, ranging from sexual acts to recording the film for later production. You can apply Foucault's theory of heterotopic spaces to this. He talks about how spaces can have more of a meaning to them than just what meets the eye. Another theory that can be applied is Freud's idea of the uncanny. This is when something is strangely familiar. In the sense of transgressive films, they tend to show something normal, as in social norms, and then breaking of them, so people can relate to at least some part of their normality. Relatively normal people and places are used in films, and then a dark twist is put upon them. Since the dawn of any form of media, there has always been a debate as to if violent themes create violence in people. Whether it's from literature, music, or films, this argument has always occurred. This does not just have to be related to violence, but all transgressive acts that I've spoken about, even today. People argue that young people want to reenact what they are seeing on the big screen, leading to acts like the Columbine school shooting or the Batman Aurora shooting. However, on the other side of the argument, people say that transgressive films can almost be cathartic. It's a way for people to get a sort of emotional release by watching something they feel the urge to do, but instead watching it on the big screen. It can also be used as a way for people to get help for their feelings, as they can open up about things rather than suppress them, which could result in something more disastrous. In conclusion, as you can see from my video, there are many forms of transgression that can be conveyed on the big screen, some of them more extreme than others. The underlying theme of this video is that transgressive films are generally used in a way to educate people on acts that do take place, even if they cannot participate in them themselves. I also believe that transgressive films are a useful tool for adapting societies to become more open about topics and emotions that may have been suppressed in the past. However, I do believe some films that have gone the extra mile to be transgressive, like a Serbian film, can be disgusting, but no one is forcing people to watch them. They are watching it out of their own morbid curiosity, which is a trait that we all share. If people are worried about the effect of a film will have on them, they need to ask themselves, why?